Callum Brennan stared at the small glass bottle in his trembling hands, knowing it held the only thing standing between him and whatever waited on the other side. 3 days of fever had turned his body into something he barely recognized. The ranch house felt like a furnace, even though the morning air outside carried a chill. His shirt clung to his back, soaked through for the 3rd time that night. Every breath came with effort. Every thought moved through mud. The bottle caught the early light coming through the window, and for a moment he wondered if he'd even have the strength to open it. What he didn't know was that in less than an hour that bottle would be empty, and it wouldn't be him who drank it. Callum had been alone on this stretch of land for almost a decade, built the house himself, cleared the brush, dug the well. The nearest town sat 3 days' ride to the east, and he preferred it that way. Fewer questions, fewer expectations, fewer people looking at him with that mixture of pity and judgment. He'd grown tired of reading in their eyes. The fever started small, a little heat behind his forehead. Nothing worth worrying about. By the 2nd day, his hands shook so badly he could barely hold a cup steady. By the 3rd day, he knew this wasn't passing on its own. He'd made the trip to town 6 weeks back, traded good money for 3 bottles of medicine from the physician who'd set up shop above the general store, used 2 bottles already for a cough that tried to settle in his chest last month. This was the last one, his last chance. Callum pushed himself up from the bed, legs unsteady beneath him. The room tilted slightly, but he forced himself forward. Had to get water, had to take the medicine while he still had the clarity to measure it properly. He moved through the small house, one hand on the wall for balance, making his way toward the front door, where he kept a bucket of fresh well water on the porch. That's when he saw her. A woman lay crumpled on his porch, halfway between the steps and his front door. Her traditional dress, adorned with intricate beadwork and long fringe, marked her as native to these lands. The morning sun caught the silver of her earrings, the only thing about her that moved as a slight breeze passed through. Callum froze in the doorway, bottle still clutched in his hand. She wasn't moving. He took a step closer. His fever-addled mind trying to make sense of what he was seeing. Had she collapsed there? How long had she been lying on his porch? Her face was turned away from him. Dark hair spread across the weathered wood. But even from where he stood, he could see the unnatural stillness of her body. Then he saw the rise and fall of her back. Shallow, irregular, but breathing. Callum knelt beside her, his own weakness making the movement awkward. He reached out, touched her shoulder gently. Her skin burned beneath the fabric of her dress, hotter than his, hotter than seemed possible. She didn't respond to his touch, didn't open her eyes, didn't make a sound. He looked at the bottle in his hand, then back at the woman dying on his porch. His mind raced through impossible calculations. The medicine in this bottle was measured for 1 person, 1 treatment. There wasn't enough for 2. Callum felt his own fever surging, felt the weakness in his limbs, felt the way his vision blurred at the edges. He knew what his body needed, knew what would happen if he didn't take this medicine soon. But looking at her, at the way her breathing caught and stuttered, at the deathly pore beneath her sun-touched skin, he knew something else too. She wouldn't last until morning without help, and neither would he. His hand tightened around the bottle, and for the first time in 3 days, the fever wasn't the thing that made him shake. Callum's father used to say that a man's character showed clearest when nobody was watching. Sitting on that porch, bottle in one hand, the other resting on the shoulder of a dying stranger. Callum understood what the old man meant. Nobody would ever know what happened here. The nearest soul was days away. He could take the medicine. And this woman would simply be another person who didn't make it through the harsh realities of frontier life. His hand moved to uncork the bottle, his body screamed for it, every muscle etched, his vision swam. The fever had progressed to the point where he could feel his thoughts beginning to scatter like frightened birds. But something stopped him. Maybe it was the way her breathing hitched, shallow and desperate. Maybe it was seeing someone worse off than himself. Maybe it was just that after 10 years of isolation, of choosing solitude over community, of building walls instead of bridges, he was tired of being the kind of man who could walk away. Callum looked at the woman's face, really looked at her for the first time. She was young, 18, maybe 19 at most. The intricate beadwork on her dress spoke of skill and care. Someone who was valued, who would be missed. Her braided hair had come partially loose, strands sticking to her fevered face. He made his decision before he could think about it too long. Callum lifted her head gently, cradling it in the crook of his arm. She was lighter than he expected. Or maybe he was weaker than he wanted to admit. Her eyes fluttered, but didn't open. He uncorked the bottle with his teeth. The bitter smell of the medicine sharp in the morning air. Getting her to swallow was harder. Most of it ran down her chin at first. He tried again, tilting her head back slightly, speaking to her even though she couldn't hear him. "Come on, you have to swallow. Come on." Some instinct in her responded. Her throat worked. Once, twice, the medicine went down. Callum gave her the entire bottle, every drop. The part of his mind still capable of basic arithmetic knew he was signing his own death warrant. That medicine was carefully measured. The physician had been clear about dosage. 1 bottle, 1 person taken over the course of a day. He'd just given it all to someone who might not even survive to see sunset. When the bottle was empty, he set it down on the porch beside them and carefully lowered her head back to the wooden boards. His hands shook worse now. Whether from the fever or from what he'd just done, he couldn't tell. Callum tried to stand, but his legs wouldn't hold him anymore. He sat down hard, back against the porch post. The woman lying a few feet away. The sun was climbing higher. It would be a hot day, he could already feel it. His eyes grew heavy. The fever wrapped around him like a thick blanket, pulling him down into a darkness that felt almost welcoming. His last conscious thought was wondering if they'd find their bodies here. 2 strangers who died on the same porch for different reasons. But as his eyes closed, he didn't see the woman's fingers twitch. Didn't see her chest rise with a slightly deeper breath. Didn't see the first sign that the medicine was beginning to work. Didn't see her eyes open, just a sliver before his world went black. Yida's first conscious thought was pain. It filled every corner of her body, a deep ache that seemed to come from her bones themselves. Her second thought was confusion. The wooden boards beneath her cheek were wrong, unfamiliar, not the smooth leather of her family's dwelling. Not the woven mats she'd known her entire life. She forced her eyes open. The mid-day sun so bright it felt like needles. She was on a porch, a stranger's porch. The house behind her was simple, weathered wood with a fresh coat of white paint, the kind settlers built when they claimed land that didn't belong to them. Ida tried to piece together how she'd gotten here. She remembered the fever starting yesterday morning. Remembered her father to Houghton, making her drink bitter tea that did nothing to break the heat consuming her from within. Remembered walking, desperate for cool water, following the creek bed that led away from their camp. After that, everything became fragments collapsing. The wooden steps beneath her hands, the blessed shade of a porch roof. She turned her head, the movement sending waves of dizziness through her, and saw him. A man slumped against the porch post, head tilted at an unnatural angle, shirt dark with sweat. His breathing was loud in the quiet afternoon. each inhale a ragged struggle. Even from several feet away, she could see the violent tremor running through his limbs. He was burning up, worse than she had been. Aida's eyes traveled to the empty glass bottle lying on its side between them. She recognized the shape, trade medicine, the kind the traveling physician sold in the settlements. Her people rarely trusted such things, preferring their own remedies, but she'd seen these bottles before. Understanding came slowly through the fog still clouding her mind. She touched her own forehead, still warm, but nothing like before. The fever that had been consuming her had broken, or at least retreated to something manageable. This man, this stranger, had given her his medicine. All of it, judging by the empty bottle, Aida pushed herself to sitting, her body protesting every movement. The beadwork on her dress caught the light, the careful patterns her mother had taught her to make. Patterns that told stories that marked her family, that connected her to something older than the settlement spreading across the land. She looked at the man again. He needed help, needed it desperately. But she was alone here, miles from her father's camp, barely able to sit upright herself. The nearest settlement was days away. Even if she could ride, she didn't see a horse, just an empty corral beside the house, the fence post standing silent sentinel. Her father would know what to do. Tahatan had knowledge passed down through generations, plants and roots and treatments the settlers had never heard of. But he was too far away. By the time she could make it back to camp, this man would be dead. Aida touched the empty bottle again, turned it over in her hands. Why had he done it? She was nobody to him, a stranger. Her people and his had never been allies. The history between them was written in broken treaties and burned villages, and suspicion that ran deep as roots. Yet he'd saved her life. She struggled to her feet, had to grab the porch railing to keep from falling. Her legs felt like water, but she forced them to hold her weight. She moved to where the man sat, crouched beside him. His face was slack with unconsciousness, skin flushed with dangerous heat. She placed her hand on his forehead and pulled it back immediately. He was burning alive from the inside. Aida knew enough about fever to understand what she was seeing. He had hours at most, maybe less. Her mind raced through what she knew, what her father had taught her, what plants grew in this region, what treatments were possible with what she could find nearby. It wasn't much, wasn't nearly enough, but maybe, just maybe, there was one option left. She would have to leave him. Would have to ride through the afternoon heat, through terrain that would test her even at full strength. Would have to pray that her father hadn't moved camp. Would have to pray that she could find her way back before this stranger's fever took what remained of his life. Aida looked at the man one last time, at the face of someone who'd chosen her life over his own and made her decision. Aida moved through the stranger's property with purpose she didn't quite feel. Every step required concentration. Her body wanted to collapse back onto that porch, wanted to surrender to the weakness still coursing through her veins. But the image of the man's fever-ravaged face kept her moving. She found the barn behind the house, a modest structure that had seen better years. The door hung slightly crooked on its hinges. Inside, the air was thick with heat and the smell of old hay. Her eyes adjusted to the dimness, searching for what she hoped would be there. A single horse stood in the back stall, a gray mare with intelligent eyes that tracked Aida's movements. The animal looked well-fed, healthy. Beside the stall hung a simple saddle and bridle, leather cracked but serviceable. Aida approached slowly, hand extended. The mare snorted, but didn't shy away. Good. She couldn't afford to waste time chasing a skittish animal. Her hands trembled as she lifted the saddle. It was heavier than she remembered things being. The fever had stolen more of her strength than she wanted to admit. Getting the saddle onto the mare took 3 attempts. By the third, Aida's arms burned and her vision swam. She leaned against the stall wall, breathing hard, forcing her body to cooperate. The horse waited patiently, as if sensing the desperation of the moment. When she finally led the mare out into the afternoon sun, Aida had to stop and orient herself. The creek bed she'd followed earlier should run north from here. Follow it upstream, and she'd find familiar markers. From there she could navigate to where her father's group had camped 3 days ago. If they'd moved, she'd have to track them. Time she didn't have. Mounting the horse required using a fence post for leverage. Even then, she nearly fell twice before managing to swing her leg over. Once seated, she allowed herself 10 seconds to catch her breath, then turned the mare toward the creek. The ride became a blur of endurance. The sun burned overhead, and Aida had left without water or supplies. Her dress, still damp with the sweat of her fever, offered little protection. The mare moved at a steady pace, but every jolt sent waves of nausea through Aida's stomach. She recognized the twisted cottonwood first, its trunk split by lightning years ago, then the red rocks jutting from the hillside like broken teeth. Her people had camped near here countless times, moving with the seasons, following water and game. The landmarks were as familiar as her own face. The sun had moved considerably by the time she spotted the thin column of smoke rising in the distance. Her heart lurched with relief so intense it was almost painful. They were still there. Her father was still there. Aida urged the mare faster, though the animal was already exhausted. They crested a low rise, and she could see the camp spread below. 4 dwellings arranged in a loose circle, horses grazing nearby, a small fire burning at the center. Home, she recognized her father immediately. Tahatan stood near the fire, speaking with 2 other men. Even from this distance, she could see the way he held himself, the quiet authority that came not from volume, but from respect earned over decades. Aida tried to call out, but her voice came as barely a whisper. She urged the mare down the slope, and movement caught her father's eye. He turned, saw her, and the conversation stopped mid-sentence. She watched his expression change as she drew closer, saw him register her weakened state, her borrowed horse, the desperation written across her features. He was moving toward her before she reached the camp's edge. Aida slid from the saddle more than dismounted, her father's hands catching her before her legs gave out entirely. "Daughter," his voice was steady, but she heard the concern beneath it. "You should not be traveling. The fever, father." She gripped his arms, forced herself to meet his eyes. "A man is dying. He saved my life, gave me his only medicine. I need your help." Tehatan's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes. "A settler?" "Yes." The silence stretched between them, heavy with years of history that Aida didn't fully understand. Finally, her father spoke, "Show me where." Tahatan moved with efficiency born from years of healing. He disappeared into his dwelling and emerged moments later with a leather satchel, its surface worn smooth from use. Inside, Aida knew were bundles of dried plants, roots harvested at specific times, bark stripped from trees that grew only in certain places. Knowledge passed down through generations, refined through observation and experience. "You cannot ride again so soon," he said, securing the satchel to his horse. "You will rest here, father. You need to recover." His tone left no room for argument. "I will find this man." "You have done your part." Aida wanted to protest, but her body was already betraying her. The ride from the settler's property had cost her the last of her reserves. Her father was right. Another journey would accomplish nothing except making her burden instead of help. She described the location carefully. The creek bed, the twisted cottonwood, the white house with the covered porch. Tahetan listened without interruption, his face revealing nothing of what he thought about this unprecedented mission. "How long ago did you leave him?" he asked when she finished. Aida tried to calculate the sun's position when she'd left. Its position now, 3 hours, maybe 4. Something flickered across her father's face. Too quick to read, he mounted his horse without another word, turned it toward the direction Aida had come from, and rode out at a pace that spoke of urgency without panic. Years of experience had taught him how to measure time against the progression of fever, how to gauge what could be saved and what was already lost. The ride back felt longer than it had that morning. Tahetan knew these lands like the lines on his own palms, but sunset was approaching. He pushed his horse faster than he normally would, driven by something he didn't want to examine too closely. His daughter had asked for his help. That should have been reason enough, but there was something else in the story she'd told. A settler who'd given his only medicine to a stranger, who'd chosen certain death over the possibility of survival. Such actions were rare in any man, rarer still between peoples who'd spent generations as adversaries. Tahetan spotted the house as the sun touched the horizon. He'd been this way before years ago, but had never approached the dwelling. Settler territories were best avoided. Less contact meant fewer conflicts. He dismounted at the porch steps, tying his horse to the railing. The man still slumped against the post where Aida had left him, but his position had shifted slightly. His head had rolled to one side, and the violent tremor she'd described had progressed to occasional convulsions that shook his entire frame. Tahetan climbed the steps and knelt beside the stranger. He placed his hand on the man's forehead first, a gesture that transcended cultural boundaries. The heat was profound, the kind that cooked the brain, that left permanent damage even in those lucky enough to survive. He checked the pulse at the man's neck. Rapid, thready, the body fighting a battle it was losing. Tahetan opened his satchel and began working with practiced precision. First, he needed to bring down the fever before it caused irreversible harm. He crushed willow bark between his fingers, mixed it with water from his pouch, creating a paste. Getting it past the man's lips required patience. Most ran down his chin, but some made it through. Next came fever FW, a plant the settlers called by different names, but whose properties were identical regardless of language. He prepared a compress, soaking strips of cloth in an infusion he'd made that morning for a different patient. The timing was fortunate. Sometimes the materials you needed were simply at hand. He worked through the evening, monitoring the stranger's breathing, adjusting treatments as the fever's pattern revealed itself. This wasn't magic. This wasn't mysticism. This was observation, experience, and knowledge accumulated through generations of healers who'd learned to read the body's signals, to understand what plants did what, to know that recovery was never guaranteed, but could sometimes be coaxed forward through careful intervention. As night fell completely, Tahetan settled beside the man, prepared to watch through the dark hours, the most dangerous time, when fevers either broke or claimed their victims. He thought of his daughter's face when she'd asked for help, thought of the empty medicine bottle still lying on the porch, thought of what it meant that a stranger had saved her life, and he waited to see if he could return the favor. The hours between midnight and dawn were when fever claimed most of its victims. Tahetan had seen it countless times. The body, exhausted from fighting, simply gave up when darkness was deepest. He'd learned not to leave patients alone during those hours. Learned that sometimes presence itself was medicine. Callum's convulsions had worsened as the night wore on. His body arched against the wooden boards, muscles locking in spasms that looked painful even to witness. Tahatan had moved him inside into the small bedroom onto a proper bed where he could work more easily. The man's clothes were soaked through. Tahatan had changed them twice already, replacing wet fabric with dry, trying to manage the dangerous cycle of heat and chills. The willow bark was helping, but slowly, too slowly. Tahatan prepared another treatment, this one using iro leaves he'd harvested weeks ago specifically for fever cases. He crushed them carefully, mixing them with rendered fat to create a paste he could rub onto the man's chest and throat. The plant helped open airways, made breathing easier. Small improvements, but they accumulated. Every hour, he checked the pulse at the neck, the wrist, behind the knee. Each location told him something different about how the heart was handling the strain. The rhythm had been erratic earlier, but was starting to settle into something more regular. Not healthy yet, but moving in the right direction. Tahatan had brought water from the well, cool and clean. He used cloth strips to create compresses for the forehead, the back of the neck, the insides of the wrists, places where blood ran close to the surface, where cooling had the most impact. He changed these compresses every few minutes, working in a rhythm that was almost meditative. Around the third hour after midnight, something changed. The convulsions stopped. Callum's breathing, which had been rapid and shallow, deepened slightly. The violent heat pouring off his skin began to moderate. Not gone, not even close to normal, but less apocalyptic. Tahatan allowed himself a moment of cautious optimism. He'd seen fevers turn at this hour before, seen the moment when the body decided to fight instead of surrender. It wasn't guaranteed. The fever could resurge, but this was the first real sign that the stranger might survive. He prepared a broth using dried meat and herbs from his satchel, something nutrient-dense that could be gotten down in small amounts. The man had been unconscious for hours now, burning through whatever reserves his body had left. If he woke, he'd need sustenance immediately. Tahatan found himself studying the stranger's face in the lamplight. Weathered skin spoke of years spent outdoors. The calluses on his hands told of physical labor. This was a working man, someone who'd built something here in isolation. The house was well maintained despite its simplicity. The barn, though small, was sturdy. This man took care of what was his, and he'd given away his last chance at survival for a stranger. Tahatan had lived through enough years to know how rare that was. Most people talked about sacrifice, about helping others. Few actually did it when the cost was their own life. Yet this settler, who had every reason to see Oyita as an enemy, had made that choice without hesitation. The implications of that choice sat heavy into Hatan's mind. His people and the settlers had existed in a state of uneasy distance for years, sometimes erupting into violence, more often simply avoiding each other, building walls of mistrust that seemed permanent, but walls could be torn down, bridges could be built. Sometimes it only took one person willing to make the first move. As dawn approached, the first gray light creeping through the window, Callum's eyes moved beneath their lids. The first sign of returning consciousness. His breathing changed again, becoming more purposeful, less automatic. Tahatan leaned forward, prepared for the moment when awareness would return, prepared to explain why a native healer was sitting beside a settler's bed, prepared to tell this man that the life he'd saved had saved him in return. The stranger's eyes opened slowly, unfocused, at first struggling to make sense of what they were seeing. When they finally locked onto Tahatan's face, sitting there in the early morning light beside his bed, Tahatan saw the confusion, saw the moment of fear, then saw something else. Recognition, perhaps, or simply acceptance that whatever was happening, he was too weak to resist it. Tahatan spoke first, his voice quiet in the dawn stillness. "Your fever has broken. You will live. Callum's throat felt like he'd swallowed sand. He tried to speak, but only managed a rough sound that barely qualified as human. The man beside his bed reached for something beyond Callum's field of vision, then brought a cup to his lips, water cool and clean. Callum drank greedily, some spilling down his chin. Slowly, the man said. His accent was different from what Callum was used to, but the English was clear. "Too fast and you will be sick." Callum forced himself to slow down, taking small sips. Even though everything in him wanted to drain the cup, his mind was still catching up, still trying to piece together what had happened. He remembered the woman on his porch, remembered the fever consuming him, remembered giving her the medicine. After that, nothing, a void of darkness that could have lasted hours or days. How long? His voice came out as barely a whisper. "Since yesterday afternoon, when I found you." The man set the cup aside, his movements economical and practiced. "Fever nearly took you. It was close." Callum's eyes traced the room slowly. His bedroom, someone had cleaned it. The window was open, letting in morning air. Strips of cloth lay in a basin beside the bed. His clothes had been changed. This stranger had spent the night keeping him alive. The woman Callum managed on the porch. "Is she my daughter?" Oyita, something that might have been approval, crossed the man's face. "She lives because of what you did. The medicine you gave her broke the fever. She rode to find me." The pieces started fitting together. The woman had survived, had somehow found the strength to seek help, had brought this man back to save him. The symmetry of it would have been poetic if Callum had energy for poetry. "I'm Tahatan," the man gestured to himself. "I am a healer among my people." Callum, it took effort to get his own name out, Callum Brennan. They sat in silence for a moment, an unlikely pair brought together by fever and circumstance. Callum studied the man more carefully now, older than he'd first appeared, 50, maybe more. His face was deeply lined, but his eyes were sharp, hands that moved with certainty. This was someone who'd spent a lifetime learning to read bodies, to understand sickness, to coax people back from the edge. "Why?" Callum asked finally. "Your people and mine were not exactly friends." Tahatan considered the question, his expression thoughtful. "My daughter asked for my help. That would have been reason enough, but she told me what you did. How you gave her your only medicine knowing what it would cost you." He paused. Such actions are rare. They deserve to be answered in kind. Callum closed his eyes, exhaustion pulling at him despite having just woken. "I didn't do it expecting anything back. I know. That is why I came." The simple truth of that statement hung in the air between them. Callum had saved Oyita because it was the right thing to do, not because he expected reward or recognition. And Tahatan had saved Callum for the same reason. Two acts of humanity that transcended the barriers people built between themselves. "The broth is ready when you can eat," Tahatan said, rising from his seat beside the bed. "Your body needs nutrients." "The fever took much from you. Wait." Callum opened his eyes again. "How long until I can move around properly?" "Days, maybe a week. The fever damaged your strength. Recovery takes time." Tahatan moved toward the door, then paused. "There is no rush. I will stay until you are steady enough to manage alone. You don't have to. I know." Tahatan's expression was unreadable, "But I will." After he left, Callum lay staring at the ceiling, processing everything. He'd lived alone for a decade by choice, had convinced himself that isolation was preferable to the complications of community, had built walls because walls felt safer than bridges. Then a woman had collapsed on his porch, and everything changed. He thought about the empty medicine bottle, about the moment he'd made his choice. about how close he'd come to dying on that porch beside a stranger, about waking to find that stranger's father sitting beside his bed, having spent the night keeping him alive. Maybe walls weren't always the answer. Maybe sometimes the strongest thing a person could do was tear them down. Outside, the sun climbed higher into a clear sky. Callum's fever was broken. His body would recover with time, but something else had broken, too. Something that had kept him isolated and alone for too long. And in its place, something new was beginning to grow. Something that felt like possibility, like connection, like the beginning of a bridge that had started with one impossible choice on a desperate morning. 5 days passed before Callum could stand without his legs, threatening to give out. 5 days of Tahatan bringing broth that gradually became solid food, of treatments that reduced inflammation, of slow walks from the bed to the chair and back again. Progress measured in inches, not miles. On the morning of the 6th day, Callum made it to the porch under his own power. Tahatan followed at a careful distance, ready to catch him if necessary. But Callum's legs held. He lowered himself into the chair where he used to sit alone every evening, watching the sunset over land he'd claimed as his own. The view looked different now, or maybe he was seeing it differently. He heard the horse before he saw it. Tahatan heard it too, his posture shifting slightly. A gray mare crested the small rise, and Callum recognized her immediately. His own horse, the one I must have taken. The woman riding her was the same person he'd found collapsed on his porch, yet completely transformed, no longer fever pale and unconscious. Now she sat upright, her traditional dress bright in the morning sun, moving with the easy confidence of someone who'd spent a lifetime on horseback. Aida dismounted before the horse had fully stopped, her eyes finding her father first, then settling on Callum. For a long moment, nobody spoke. The silence stretched, but it wasn't uncomfortable. Just 3 people acknowledging the weight of what had passed between them. "You look better," Aida said finally. Her English was accented, but clear, like her father's, then half dead on a porch. Callum managed a weak smile. That's not a high standard. She didn't smile back, but something softened in her expression. She climbed the porch steps slowly, deliberately, until she stood directly in front of him. Then, carefully, she reached into a pouch at her waist and pulled out the empty medicine bottle, the one Callum had given her, the one that had saved her life and nearly cost him his. She held it out to him. "My father says you knew what this choice meant, that you made it anyway." Callum took the bottle, turned it over in his hands. It felt lighter than he remembered. "I didn't really think about it. Just saw someone who needed help more than I did. That is what makes it matter." Aida glanced at her father, something passing between them that Callum couldn't quite read. "We brought you something, a trade of sorts." Tahatan stepped forward, producing a small bundle wrapped in soft leather. He placed it in Callum's hands. Inside were packets of dried plants, carefully labeled in a script Callum didn't recognize. But Tahatan explained each one, what it treated, how to prepare it, when to use it. "This land can be harsh." Tahatan said, "Fever will come again, injuries happen, these will help, and if they are not enough, you know where to find me now." The implications of that statement weren't lost on Callum. An invitation, an open door, a bridge built from 2 acts of compassion that had somehow survived the weight of history and suspicion. "I don't know what to say," Callum admitted. "Say you will use them." Aida's voice was firm. "Say you will not wait until you are dying to ask for help. Say you will remember that not all strangers are enemies," Tahatan added quietly. Callum looked at the bundle in his hands, at the father and daughter who'd saved his life, At the bridge they'd built together from nothing but impossible choices and stubborn hope. He'd spent 10 years believing that isolation was safety, that walls protected better than bridges. He'd been wrong. "I'll remember," he said, and meant it. Ada nodded once. Satisfied, she mounted her horse again, and Tahatan did the same. But before they rode away, Callum called out, "The grey mare, she's yours now. Seems only fair." Oyita looked at the horse, then back at him. "A gift, a trade," Callum corrected, "for the medicine you've given me and for teaching me that some walls need to come down." This time Ada did smile, small but genuine. She turned the grey mare alongside her father's mount, and together they rode toward the horizon where the sun was climbing higher. Callum watched them go, the bundle of medicine still warm in his hands, and realized something had changed permanently. Not just in him. In the space between peoples who'd spent too long seeing each other as other, one choice on a desperate morning had started it. But what happened next would be up to all of them. If you enjoyed this story of sacrifice and unexpected connections in the wild frontier, click the video on your screen to watch another compelling tale from the untamed territories. And don't forget to subscribe so you never miss a story about courage, redemption, and the bridges we build across impossible distances.